Welcome to Freedom Fighters Code Grey. This is a show where we discuss human trafficking, an issue that's taking place across Canada and in our backyard. How is the child welfare system connected to human trafficking? According to the Canadian Women's Foundation, over 51% of girls who are trafficked in Canada have been involved in the child welfare system. Why is that the case? In today's episode, we'll be addressing this question with expert Dr. Kyla McDonald, who's joined us to share her expertise and knowledge on this topic. Thank you so much, Kyla, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Kyla, just to start off with, can you share a little bit about who you are and some of the work that you're currently involved in?
Absolutely. I think it's important to start personally. Personally, I'm a mom of 2 under 2, so my life is wild. But every day I get to see my kids grow and develop really right in front of my eyes, which is what my passion is. So observing development and understanding development. Academically, I began my research at Ryerson University and studying the development of trust in preschoolers. So really looking at how very, very young children develop trust in others. From there, I went to do clinical work at Sick Kids, the Hospital for Sick Children. And that really just inspired me to continue doing clinical research where the work that we were doing led to policy changes and evidence-based interventions. So from there, after finishing my PhD at Ryerson, I decided to go to York University and do a PhD in clinical developmental psychology under the supervision of Dr. Jennifer Conley. So that's what led me to the work that I'm doing today. And being in the teen relationships lab at York University, my eyes were opened there to a pressing societal issue that you just discussed, a brief overview, but namely the sex trafficking of minors, the domestic sex trafficking of minors in Canada and in Ontario. So I'm going to discuss more about that today throughout our conversation. But that really led me to focus on my dissertation, which is building a specialized model of care to support youth that are in child welfare that have been involved in sex trafficking.
It's so incredible just to hear the different areas that you have been learning about and doing research over the years and how it's led you to specifically apply some of those practices and principles and research to now provide intervention strategies for youth who have been impacted by trafficking. That's so neat. I wonder, while you're in this research journey and you're, learning about child development, and then you find yourself doing your PhD at York, why specifically trafficking as your research subject? What kind of led you? How did you find out that trafficking was happening in the community? What made you decide that this is something that you should do your PhD thesis on?
And it's interesting because it kind of seems like it would be like the connection wouldn't be there, but it really, really came together because through my early research, as I mentioned, I became interested in the development of trust and in preschoolers, which led me to become interested in the development of trust in adolescents and specifically adolescent relationships, which is why I joined Dr. Jennifer Conley's lab. And when I joined there, she was actually working with York Region CAS, understanding the development of adolescent relationships in these youth and promoting resilience among youth that were in care. So while she was doing that, and I joined sort of at the exact same time, York Regional Police and York Region CAS identified that there was an overlap among youth in care that were involved in sex trafficking. So they asked Dr. Conley and my colleague Kyla, Kyla Baird, to help them understand the factors that were associated with this really, really striking overlap. So from there, I became involved right away in a chart review to investigate the risk factors of youth involved in sex trafficking that were in child welfare.
Wow. And so you just mentioned the overlap and, the York Region Police were identifying it, individuals involved in the child welfare system were recognizing it. So based on this chart that you developed and also research you've done since then, how are these two things connected? How is the child welfare system and the issue of sex trafficking interlinked?
Mm-hmm. So no, it's a great question. So I'll start with really the connection there between child welfare and sex trafficking, and then I'll move into the chart review. But really, previous research across North America, it's repeatedly highlighted that child welfare involvement is elevated among youth that are involved in sex trafficking. But I think it's important to understand that this intersection between sex trafficking and child welfare is twofold. So youth who are extracted, I use that term loosely, from trafficking are often placed in child welfare in order to enhance their protection. But at the same time, youth involved in child welfare may be at greater risk for recruitment while they're in care. So, it's interesting because there's kind of different avenues that they could get involved based on this connection. And just briefly, risk-based research has indicated that youth in care are targeted related to possibly, not all of them, but having a lack of supervision, having poor family connections, a history of trauma and abuse, sadly. And traffickers often attend to these youth's unmet needs for positive caregiver relationships and love and belonging. So I think you're probably going to ask a bit about, York Region specifically. So I'll stop there. But that's really the overlap that we're seeing.
It's interesting how you identified those two different intersections. It's not just specifically children who are in the child welfare system who are at risk, but then there's also the factor of children, being, as you use the word, extracted from their home and placed in care, and the just different risks. I remember reading some psychology about even the impact of kids being, and this was the quote, forcibly removed from their home as an inherently traumatic experience, which therefore, from that traumatic experience in itself, made them more vulnerable and at risk to being trafficked.
Mm-hmm.
So when we look at York Region specifically, I'm just wondering, sometimes we think of this issue of trafficking and people have a hard time connecting, like, what does that actually look like in our community? There's still so many misconceptions that it's not happening here and it's happening overseas. Based on your research and the work that you're undertaking, who is trafficked? What are some of the characteristics of these individuals who have experienced exploitation?
Mm-hmm. I hear that all the time too. A lot of people picture the movie Taken and they think that that's, what trafficking is. But I'll talk a bit about our chart review that was specific to York Region. So that was published in the Canadian Journal of Behavioral Science. And what we looked at there was from 2008 to 2016. It included over 200 individuals from York Region that were trafficked for sex. So of this group, 52 of these youth were involved in child welfare. So that's a very high number. So overall, those initial findings continue to really underscore the high risk status of youth involved in child welfare. And the majority of the total sample was recruited into sex trafficking as minors, and all child welfare youth were recruited under the age of 18. So youth that they were recruited domestically. So as we mentioned, within Canada, and child welfare youth from the sample were more likely to come from a group home, a single parent home, or a foster home. So these youth were also more likely to use alcohol or other substances and experience childhood maltreatment.
There's so many important things that you just highlighted there that I feel like people need to understand. This is a domestic issue. These are individuals who are under the age of 18. You mentioned minors who are Canadian, who are experiencing exploitation. And then you just identified a whole number of risk factors. So yes, being a part of the child welfare system has been an identified risk factor, but same with child abuse, or child maltreatment, and substance use. So it is a complex problem with many interconnections, and we can see how many youth in our community could be vulnerable to experience exploitation based on those factors. But I kind of want to tease that out a little bit more. From your experience in research, why are children who are in the child welfare system particularly at risk to experiencing exploitation?
So this is really likely related to these youth, as we talked about, having elevated risk factors a combination of more unmet needs. So for instance, youth that are trafficked in child welfare are more likely, and this is based on research, than non-exploited peers, including youth in the justice system, to have familial ruptures, past instances of childhood maltreatment, runaway behavior, demonstrate externalizing behavior, so getting into fights, and have mental health difficulties, including substance use problems and complex trauma. So traffickers attend to these heightened risks, and they exploit youth's most basic needs. So if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I'm sure you guys have heard about this and talked about this in the past, but the trafficker or the pimp might artificially provide physiological safety needs by providing the youth with shelter, money, drugs, or provide love and belonging, and I'm going to use that in quotations because it's really artificial, and exploit the youth's need to feel good or fit in somewhere by recruiting them into the sex trade.
I really appreciate how you use the word artificial to describe how the trafficker is attempting to meet some of these needs. And so could you maybe give an example of a situation where someone, for example, you mentioned running away. So a youth is leaving for who knows, a variety of situations that could be coming up. And how might a trafficker identify potential unmet needs and then seek to fulfill them? What does that actually look like?
Mm-hmm. Well, it could be a location the youth has run away to. Traffickers often target youth. They could be running away to a bus stop, or, see them outside on the street or something like that. And because the youth has a need at this moment for shelter, or money or something like that, the trafficker makes these promises, and it might be, I could, come with me and I'll let you live in my condo, and I'll take care of you, and I'll give you, money and this sort of thing. But really, that money they initially give the youth or the individual involved in trafficking is often taken back, and it comes with a cost. So
the traffickers, in a way, demand repayment for whatever they've given them, Absolutely. Whether it's shelter, food, money, material items. And so there's a type of coercion and blackmail.
Absolutely. And this is sometimes this debt bondage. So they're saying, okay, I did this for you. Now you have to do this for me.
And I think that's really important for viewers to understand that individuals who are in this situation, it's very complex psychological manipulation that traffickers are using to hold them in these situations, which can make it really difficult to leave. Well, Kyla, it's been so great chatting with you and learning more about how the child welfare system and human trafficking are interconnected. We'll be right back after a short break. And welcome back to Freedom Fighters Code Gray. In today's episode, we're addressing the interconnection between the child welfare system and sex trafficking. Kyla McDonald is here sharing her research and expertise and knowledge on this subject. Kyla, it's just been so informative learning from you and all this work that you've undertaken. I know that you and your team have done some research specifically on some of the roots, some of the pathways into situations of sex trafficking. And I was wondering if you could spend some time just unpacking that for us.
Absolutely. So I'll talk about some of the research my colleague Kyla Baird has done. She just recently published a systematic review. She's done a lot of work on this question. We also looked at this question through our chart review that was published. So really it looks initially, the roots into sex trafficking, I'm going to start with location. So where are youth recruited from? And the answer is everywhere. So we noticed through the systematic review that they're recruited through bus stops, shelters, outside juvenile justice systems, schools, malls, social gatherings, their place of employment, the neighborhood, the park, corner stores, or even within their own home, which is scary and awful. But the initial contact really is often through the internet. And internet facilitated recruitment occurs when traffickers access youth by frequenting online platforms with youth and using strategies such as initiating a relationship or deceptively posing as an old friend. So specific internet-based applications that Kyla identified through a systematic review were Facebook, Snapchat, Tinder, Instagram, Craigslist, and even online multiplayer video games. So specifically within our chart review with trafficked individuals from York region, 36% of the individuals involved in the sample reported being recruited through websites such as Kijiji or Craigslist, or through social media accounts such as Instagram or Facebook.
Wow.
And yeah, interestingly, there were no differences between those involved in child welfare and those who were not involved in welfare with regards to internet recruitment. So it really speaks to traffickers' use of the internet in recruiting youth into sex trafficking and the need to target internet safety in our intervention efforts. So when we're thinking about the process and the routes into sex trafficking, the next phase really or process is often called entrapment. And traffickers often use relational tactics. So most commonly being the trafficker posing as a boyfriend or romancing the individual. And the term often used is Romeo pimping. So other methods include befriending the youth into sex trafficking or really tasking other girls that are involved to recruit and train the youth. And both of these tactics, when we talked about that hierarchy of needs, are really drawing on the youth's need at that time for love and belonging. And in some cases, though it's less common, recruitment might also come from the biological family or from foster parent traffickers. And again, less common, but aversive tactics are also used. So I'll explain this a little bit, but this is often called guerrilla pimping. And these tactics could include abduction, threats, torture, drugging, rape, and removing all of the youth's identification so that they have to rely on the trafficker. So when we're thinking about this process and route, from there comes an enmeshment process where the youth may lose control, become dependent on the trafficker, and or have other inherent factors that really prevent them from leaving. So just thinking about removing identification, maybe there's nowhere else they can go. So, it's kind of a long-winded answer there, but that's kind of some of the routes into sex trafficking.
Wow. And you mentioned entrapment and how some of the traffickers are doing that. And so many are relationship based, and how traumatic that would be for someone who thinks someone who loves them, whether, as you mentioned, a foster parent or a boyfriend or a friend, and then manipulates them and forces them into exploitive situations. Can you talk a little bit about that specifically, that relationship, the psychological impact on the youth? Because you and I know it's very difficult to leave a trafficking situation, and someone might be viewing this and know someone who's in a trafficking situation and is struggling to know how to come alongside them. So can you just unpack a little bit about that psychological coercion and that impact on their minds?
Yeah, of course. Well, again, when we're just talking about unmet needs, if I'm thinking about some of the youth that are involved, that are, for example, involved in the child welfare system, maybe this is the first person in a while that has, paid them some attention, or, these traffickers, they go through the process of luring, and they might provide youth with gifts and attention and all of these things that might indicate that love in some way. And it might actually feel like love. It might be love. And so it becomes very difficult to think of people you love in your life. It becomes very difficult to leave somebody that you love, somebody that is artificially providing this unmet need. And so we often look at this, and we look at some of the literature when we're trying to understand this with domestic violence as well, because, you're often in a situation where it could be that violence is ensuing, someone's removed all your money, someone's taken complete control, but you're staying. And that it's very difficult to judge another individual in that situation, because at that time the trafficker is meeting a need that they haven't had filled in a while. So again, like you said, there's a lot of manipulation and coercion, and sometimes the individual might not even know. So I think that really speaks to awareness and prevention efforts, and showing youth and having people go into the school system and all that. And I know I'll talk about that a bit, but to go in and, show youth that just because somebody is giving you a pair of red Louboutins, it doesn't necessarily indicate love. And if they're not treating you properly, you shouldn't need to do anything either way. But if they're not treating you properly, there's people you could talk to, and there's people that could support you. So.
Oh, that's so good. It's so important for people to know, to not judge people who are in situations that we don't understand or haven't experienced, but that also to connect people with resources and support when they're ready and available. You mentioned prevention. Mm-hmm. And I think, as we talk about the risk factors and the roots into trafficking, all these things, prevention comes to mind as a way that we can help address this issue, how we can help reduce it in our communities. So what do you think, based on the research that you've done, is needed to help prevent child and youth, whether in the child welfare system or not, from experiencing exploitation? And more specifically, you mentioned, there's more individuals who are at risk based on different things. So is there a way to assess that, and a way that we can kind of intervene at a stage to help reduce that likelihood of them being at risk for trafficking?
Yeah, so there's definitely a massive need to identify prevention efforts. And we've really learned throughout our research, including our interviews with police, child welfare workers, and survivors, experts, that I call them, that early identification is absolutely essential to prevention and intervention. So although there are some screening measures out there and they're currently in use, at the moment, there really isn't a sex trafficking tool that's specific for the child welfare system and specific for the needs that are inherent to this population. So this is what we're working on right now. My colleagues in Jennifer Conley's lab, including another graduate student, Melody Ascari, they're in the process of evaluating a tool that can capture these risk factors and assist with prevention and intervention and placement. So if we identify that a youth is at risk based on these certain factors, well, perhaps there can be a way that we can support them, or a placement or something like that we can give them. And really this evaluating this tool involves conversations with people in the community. So individuals from child welfare, community agencies, and survivors, to really get their opinion. Is this tool good? Are there things that we could add to this tool? Is the language appropriate? Because language is so important, in really working with this population. And what risk factors are we missing? And then finally, the last part of it really involves, because our world has changed so much, the impact of COVID-19 on sex trafficking risk factors. Has it changed them at all? Has it made them worse? Has it improved some of them? So in terms of prevention, that's where I would say is an important place to start, is early identification.
And I can imagine how that tool, if it was specifically catered towards the child welfare system, would be so helpful in identifying individuals, because we know that there is a huge need for awareness and training to be able to understand the issue of trafficking. And if there was a tool that could kind of help someone easily identify that this person's maybe more at risk, or even to know what kind of questions to ask to gauge their potential experiences of exploitation, how that would really help them intervene at an early stage to prevent them from being exploited. So that's really exciting. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about that when it's completed and ready to go. I know that you mentioned earlier in our discussion that your PhD focused on looking at building intervention strategies for youth in care. And so with the little bit of time we have left, I would love if you could just share some of your insights from that work that you undertook.
Well, I could talk about this one for days, but I won't. But really, we are in the process of building a pilot model for youth involved in child welfare that have been involved in sex trafficking. That was the initial model, but now it's for youth that are at risk. So to briefly summarize, our systematic review of child welfare systems identify just the importance of potentially having therapeutic foster homes and the importance of foster parent characteristics. Foster parents being trauma informed, having training, using a harm reduction approach. And just to briefly, essentially that means that if the foster parent might allow the youth to smoke a cigarette in their car if it stopped them from running back to a trafficker, and they should have support from child welfare organization to do that. So we identified that was really important. But through our research, along with wraparound services to provide the youth and the family, but we learned that it was very difficult to match a youth with their foster parent at the same time. So we instead changed the program, the pilot model, to start with the youth. And always start with the youth. If we identify through our tool that a youth is at risk, we're going to wrap that youth around with services and support from there, and provide the youth with wraparound services, including mental health services, survivor mentors, and all that. So we're currently evaluating that pilot model. So I hope to share that with you in the future.
Yes, and we would love to have you back on the show to discuss that some more, because that sounds amazing. Empowering and equipping foster parents to be able to be trauma informed and really meeting with the youth where they're at and providing for what they need when they need it is incredible. Kyla, it's been amazing to talk to you today. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise and knowledge. I'm so grateful for the work you and your team are undertaking. If you are currently in a situation of immediate danger, please call 911 if you're able to do so. If not, please call the human trafficking hotline that's available 24/7 at 1-833-900-1010. Again, that's 1-833-900-1010. Thanks so much, and we hope to catch you next time on Freedom Fighters Code Red.